If you have seen the movie American Gangster, you know the scene. It is cinema history. It is 1968. Harlem is burning with the heat of the civil rights movement. We see Bumpy Johnson, the old king, walking into a department store with his protégé, Frank Lucas. Bumpy clutches his chest. He collapses. And as the life drains out of the most powerful black man in America, he dies in the arms of the only man he trusts. The torch is passed. The student becomes the master. Frank Lucas takes the ring, steps over the body, and becomes the new god of Harlem. It is a perfect story. It has tragedy. It has loyalty. It has the rise of a new king. There is only one problem. According to the people who were actually there, not a single frame of that scene is true. Bumpy Johnson didn't die in a department store. He didn't die in Frank Lucas's arms. And he certainly didn't pass the torch to a man he viewed as little more than a glorified errand boy. For 40 years, Frank Lucas told the world that he was Bumpy Johnson's right hand. He told magazines, he told Hollywood producers, and he told Denzel Washington that he was the heir to the throne. He spun a tale of a father-son bond that transcended the streets. He claimed he was the only one Bumpy listened to. He claimed he was the one calling the shots when the old man got tired. And the world believed him. Why wouldn't they? Bumpy was dead. He couldn't speak. The dead tell no tales. But Frank Lucas forgot one thing. Bumpy Johnson wasn't alone. He left behind a widow, Mayme Johnson, the real Queen of Harlem, a woman who knew where every skeleton was buried and exactly who held the shovel. For decades, she stayed silent, watching Frank Lucas build a legend on her husband's grave. She watched him brag. She watched him cash the checks. But when the movie came out, she finally had enough. She stepped out of the shadows and delivered a 4-word eulogy for Frank Lucas's reputation that was colder than any bullet Bumpy ever fired. She didn't scream. She didn't sue. She just told the truth about what Frank Lucas really was to Bumpy Johnson. And that truth shattered the myth of the American gangster forever. To understand the insult, you have to understand the hierarchy of Harlem in the 1940s and 50s. It was a world built on rigid codes of conduct. You didn't just walk in and become a boss. You earned it. Bumpy Johnson had earned it in blood. He had fought the Jewish mob. He had fought the Italians. And he had survived Alcatraz. He was an intellectual who read Shakespeare and Nietzsche in solitary confinement. He was a chess master who viewed the streets as a board of 64 squares. Frank Lucas was different. He arrived in Harlem in 1946, fleeing the Jim Crow South. He was a country boy from North Carolina with a 4th-grade education and a hunger that bordered on starvation. He wasn't a strategist. He was a survivor. He made his living mugging drunks and pooling hustles, scraping by on the edges of the underworld. Legend has it that Bumpy took a liking to the young man's boldness. But the street records tell a more specific story. Bumpy didn't need a partner. He needed a driver. He needed muscle. He needed someone who could stand outside the club in the freezing cold and watch the car while the real bosses discussed business inside. This is the distinction that the movie erases, but the streets remember. In the ecosystem of organized crime, there is a massive gap between a lieutenant and an associate. A lieutenant sits at the table. He knows the numbers. He knows the police contacts. He has a vote. An associate holds the coat. He opens the door. He keeps the engine running. Mayme Johnson was clear about this. She said Frank was around, yes. He was always around, like a shadow or a pet. He drove Bumpy to meetings with the Genovese family. He drove Bumpy to the racetrack. But he never sat in on the meetings. When Lucky Luciano or Frank Costello sat down with Bumpy to carve up the city, Frank Lucas was standing by the door, making sure nobody interrupted. He saw the power, but he didn't touch it. Frank Lucas would later claim he was Bumpy's student. He claimed Bumpy taught him everything he knew about the heroin trade, about the French Connection, about supply chains. But Bumpy Johnson wasn't a drug dealer in the way Frank described. Bumpy was a numbers man, a protector. He despised the way heroin was destroying Harlem. He allowed it because he couldn't stop it, and he taxed it because that was business. But he didn't love it. He certainly wasn't giving master classes on international smuggling to his driver. But Frank was watching. He was a sponge. He saw how Bumpy commanded respect. He saw how Bumpy dressed. He saw how Bumpy tipped the head waiter at Wells' restaurant. And he decided that one day he wouldn't just be the man opening the door. He would be the man walking through it. The biggest hole in Frank Lucas's story is a matter of simple math, a matter of geography. Frank claimed he was by Bumpy's side every day for 15 years, learning the trade, absorbing the wisdom of the Don. But history tells us that for the vast majority of that time, Bumpy Johnson wasn't in Harlem. He was in a cell. In 1952, Bumpy was sentenced to 15 years in Alcatraz for a drug conspiracy charge, a charge he fought until his dying day. He didn't return to the streets until 1963. That is an 11-year gap. 11 years where Bumpy was locked in a cage 3,000 miles away in San Francisco Bay. Where was Frank Lucas during this time? Was he running the empire? Was he keeping the seat warm? No. The empire was being run by Bumpy's true lieutenants, men like Junie Bird, Red Dillard, and Nat Pettigrew. These were the heavyweights, the men with the reputation and the scars to prove it. Frank Lucas was still on the periphery. He was hustling, running craps games, moving small amounts of product. He was a nobody in the grand scheme of the New York underworld. When Bumpy returned in 1963, the world had changed. The Italians were tighter. The police were smarter. The heroin epidemic was beginning to swell into a tsunami. Bumpy was an old lion returning to a jungle that had grown wilder. He needed reliable men. He needed loyalty. And Frank Lucas was there. This is where the grain of truth exists in the lie. Frank Lucas was loyal. He was useful. He was the young, hungry enforcer that an aging boss needs to keep the wolves at bay. Bumpy kept him close. He appreciated Frank's ambition, even if he found it reckless. There are stories of Bumpy bailing Frank out of trouble, paying his legal fees, lecturing him about being too flashy. Bumpy moved in silence. Frank wanted to be a neon sign. It was a clash of philosophies. Bumpy believed that a gangster's power came from the community. You fed the poor at Thanksgiving. You paid people's rent. You kept order. Frank believed power came from fear and money. Pure, uncut capitalism. He didn't care about the community. He cared about the profit margin. Mayme Johnson watched this dynamic play out in her living room. She saw Frank sitting on her plastic-covered furniture, nodding eagerly as Bumpy spoke, his eyes darting around the apartment, calculating the value of the paintings on the wall. She saw a man who wasn't looking for a father. He was looking for a blueprint to steal. By 1966, the tension was building. Bumpy was tired. His heart was failing. The years in Alcatraz had taken their toll. He spent his days reading newspapers, playing chess, and trying to navigate the treacherous waters between the Black Power movement and the Italian mafia. He was meeting with Malcolm X, trying to find a place for his people in a changing America. Frank Lucas, on the other hand, was growing impatient. He saw Bumpy's caution as weakness. He saw the Italians taking a massive cut of Harlem's money, and he wanted it for himself. He began to make moves that Bumpy hadn't authorized. He began to talk a little louder in the bars. He began to wear suits that cost more than Bumpy's car. The streets talk. And the word on the street was that Frank was getting too big for his britches. He was telling people he was the heir apparent. He was telling people that Bumpy was losing his step. It was the classic mistake of the understudy. He thought that because he knew the lines, he could play the part. But he didn't have the presence. He didn't have the soul. One specific incident captures this dynamic perfectly. It wasn't a shootout. It wasn't a drug deal. It was a dinner. Frank Lucas showed up to a meeting wearing a loud, flashy coat, dripping with jewelry. He was loud, boisterous, trying to impress the Italian heavyweights at the table. Bumpy didn't shout at him. He didn't slap him. He just looked at him. A long, cold stare that sucked the air out of the room. He leaned over and whispered something to Frank. Frank stopped laughing. He sat down. He shut up. We don't know exactly what was said that night, but we know the message. You are not the boss. You are here because I allow you to be here. Frank swallowed the insult, but he kept the resentment. He waited. He knew that time was on his side. The lion was dying, and the hyena was ready to feast. July 7th, 1968. The day the myth begins. The movie American Gangster shows us a dramatic heart attack in a department store, but the truth was far more mundane and far more telling. Bumpy Johnson was at Wells' restaurant in Harlem. It was his favorite spot. He was eating breakfast, scrambled eggs, grits, and coffee. He was surrounded by his real friends. Junie Bird, his lifelong friend and enforcer, was there. Frank Lucas was not there. According to the witnesses, and according to Mayme Johnson, Bumpy clutched his chest. He was in pain. He didn't give a speech. He didn't hand over a key to the city. He simply collapsed. Junie Bird caught him. Junie Bird held him as he died. The man who had been by his side since the 1930s was the man who held him at the end. Frank Lucas was nowhere near Wells' restaurant. He was likely out hustling, or sleeping, or running one of his scams. But in the chaos that followed Bumpy's death, a vacuum opened up. The king was dead. The throne was empty. The Italians were looking for a new contact. The street soldiers were looking for a new leader. And Frank Lucas saw his opportunity. He knew that nobody would fact-check him. He knew that Junie Bird was too old and too street-smart to go around giving interviews to magazines. So Frank started talking. He started telling anyone who would listen that he was there. He told them Bumpy died in his arms. He told them Bumpy's last words were instructions to him. He hijacked the death of the most famous man in Harlem and made it the opening scene of his own movie. It was a brilliant lie. It gave him instant legitimacy. If Bumpy Johnson chose him, then who could question him? The Italians bought it because they needed someone to move the heroin. The young hustlers bought it because they wanted to believe in the legend. And Mayme Johnson? She was grieving. She was burying her husband. She heard the whispers. She heard Frank bragging. But she was a lady of the old school. She didn't get into shouting matches in the street. She kept her dignity. She kept her silence. She let Frank Lucas have his moment. She let him build his blue magic empire. She let him wear his chinchilla coats and sit ringside at the Ali fight. But she never forgot. She kept the truth locked away in her heart like a loaded pistol, waiting for the right moment to pull the trigger. It would take 40 years, but when she finally spoke, the shot would be heard around the world. Frank Lucas thought he had gotten away with it. He thought he had written himself into history, but he forgot the first rule of the Harlem underworld. The truth doesn't expire. It just waits. Fast forward 40 years. The year is 2007. The neon lights of Harlem have been replaced by the flashbulbs of the red carpet. Frank Lucas is an old man, wheeling himself through the premiere of a film that bears his nickname. He is smiling. He is shaking hands. He is finally standing in the spotlight he has craved since he was a boy in North Carolina. Ridley Scott, one of the biggest directors in Hollywood, has turned his life into an epic. And he isn't just getting a movie, he is getting Denzel Washington. Denzel, the most charismatic actor on the planet, is playing Frank Lucas. When American Gangster hit the theaters, it wasn't just a movie. It was a cultural event. It grossed $260 million. It was nominated for Oscars. It became the new Scarface for a generation of hip-hop fans. Jay-Z released an entire concept album inspired by the film. Frank Lucas was suddenly more than a former inmate. He was a folk hero. He was on television, telling stories about his blue magic heroin, his connections in Vietnam, and his unbreakable bond with Bumpy Johnson. He had successfully rewritten history. But while the world was applauding, a 93-year-old woman sat in a quiet apartment in Harlem, watching the television with a look of cold fury. Mayme Johnson was supposed to be a footnote. She was supposed to be dead, or senile, or simply too tired to care. Frank Lucas had counted on her silence. He had bet his entire legacy on the assumption that the widow would never speak. He lost that bet. Mayme Johnson was sharp as a razor. She remembered every face, every name, and every debt. She watched the scene where Denzel Washington, playing Frank, holds a dying Bumpy Johnson in a department store. She watched the scene where Bumpy gives Frank his blessing. She turned off the television, looked at her biographer, and decided that the time for silence was over. She was going to burn the myth to the ground. To understand why Mayme was so angry, you have to understand the mechanics of the lie. The myth of Frank Lucas didn't start with the movie. It started 7 years earlier, in the year 2000, with a magazine article. A journalist named Mark Jacobson wrote a piece for New York Magazine titled "The Return of Superfly." In that article, Frank Lucas spun a tale so elaborate, so cinematic, that Hollywood couldn't resist it. Frank told the reporter that he was Bumpy's right hand. He claimed he was with Bumpy every day for 15 years. He claimed he had killed people on Bumpy's orders. He claimed that when Bumpy died, he left the keys to the kingdom to Frank. It was a masterclass in manipulation. Frank knew that Bumpy was dead. He knew that the other heavy hitters of that era, men who would have laughed in his face, were either dead or in prison for life. There was no one left to fact-check him. or so he thought. The movie took these lies and amplified them. It portrayed Frank Lucas as a business genius who revolutionized the drug trade. It portrayed him as a man of honor who only killed when necessary. But the most offensive fabrication, the one that made Mayme Johnson's blood boil, was the portrayal of his relationship with her husband. In the film, they are equals. They are father and son. There is a warmth, a mutual respect. But Mayme Johnson knew the reality of that relationship. She knew that Frank Lucas was terrified of Bumpy Johnson. She remembered the times Frank would come to their apartment, hat in hand, waiting in the hallway like a servant until Bumpy was ready to see him. She remembered Bumpy complaining about Frank's loudness, his lack of discretion, his desperate need for attention. Mayme Johnson wrote a book. She titled it Harlem Godfather, The Rap on My Husband, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. It wasn't just a memoir, it was an indictment. She went on the radio. She gave interviews to newspapers. And she didn't use the polite language of a grandmother. She used the language of a woman who had survived the golden age of organized crime. When an interviewer finally asked her the question that everyone wanted to know, what was Frank Lucas's real job? Mayme didn't hesitate. She didn't pause. She looked into the camera and delivered 4 words that stripped the American gangster of all his glory. She said, "He held the coat." 4 words. He held the coat. It sounds simple, but in the underworld, it is a death sentence for a reputation. To say a man held the coat is to say he was furniture. It means he was a valet. It means that while the bosses were sitting at the table discussing life and death, Frank Lucas was standing by the door, holding Bumpy's overcoat, hoping for a tip. She elaborated. She said, Frank was a driver. If Bumpy was cold, Frank held his coat. If Bumpy was hot, Frank held his coat. That's all he did. She dismantled the specific lies of the movie with the precision of a prosecutor. She addressed the famous death scene. Frank wasn't with Bumpy when he died, she said. Frank wasn't even in the neighborhood. Bumpy died in Junie Bird's arms, not Frank's. Frank Lucas is a liar. She attacked his claim that he was Bumpy's heir. Bumpy didn't have an heir, she explained. Bumpy didn't believe in the drug trade the way Frank did. Bumpy was a numbers man. He didn't pass the torch to a heroin dealer. When Bumpy died, the organization didn't go to Frank. It went to the people who actually ran it. The reaction to Mayme's revelation was seismic. It gave permission for others to speak. Suddenly, the floodgates opened. Other figures from the era, men who had kept their mouths shut because of the Stop Snitching code, began to come forward. One of the most damning voices came from Nicky Barnes, known as Mr. Untouchable. Nicky Barnes was the other king of the New York heroin trade, Frank's biggest rival. Barnes was in witness protection, but when he heard about the movie, he couldn't stay silent. He wrote his own book, and he backed Mayme Johnson up completely. Nicky Barnes laughed at the idea of Frank Lucas being a boss. He called Frank a flim-flam man. He said that Frank's story about smuggling heroin in the coffins of dead soldiers was a lie. He said Frank's story about being Bumpy's partner was a fantasy. We all knew Frank, Barnes said. He was a guy who talked a lot. But Bumpy didn't respect him. Bumpy used him for muscle, nothing more. The combined weight of the widow and the rival crushed the credibility of the movie. Historians started digging. They found court records that contradicted Frank's timeline. They found that Frank was in and out of prison during the years he claimed to be running the streets. They found that the blue magic heroin empire, while real, was nowhere near as big or as exclusive as Frank claimed. But the most painful blow came from the realization that Frank Lucas had stolen valor. He had stolen the reputation of a man who could no longer defend himself. He had taken the silence of the grave and filled it with his own ego. Mayme Johnson passed away in 2009, just 2 years after the movie came out. But she died satisfied. She had set the record straight. She had protected her husband's name. She proved that even at 93, she was still the queen of Harlem. She showed the world that while Hollywood can build a myth with million-dollar budgets and movie stars, the truth is harder than concrete. Frank Lucas lived for another 10 years. He died in 2019. He died a famous man, yes, but he died with an asterisk next to his name. Whenever his story is told now, it is accompanied by the shadow of Mayme Johnson. You cannot talk about American Gangster without talking about the lie. The tragedy of Frank Lucas is that he was a successful criminal in his own right. He did make millions. He did smuggle drugs. He did live a life of high stakes. But it wasn't enough for him. He needed to be Bumpy Johnson. He needed the validation of the king. And by trying to steal that validation, he exposed his own insecurity. He revealed that deep down, he was still the boy from the South, desperate to be invited to the big table. The legacy of this story is a lesson in the power of the truth. We live in an age of fake news, of viral stories, of movies that claim to be based on actual events. It is easy to get swept up in the glamour. It is easy to believe Denzel Washington, but the streets have a long memory. Bumpy Johnson was a complex man. He was a criminal, yes, but he was also a community leader, a philosopher, and a man of his word. He played a game of chess that lasted 40 years, and his final move, the move that checkmated Frank Lucas from beyond the grave, was the loyalty he inspired in his wife. He didn't need to leave a will. He didn't need to leave a public statement. He left Mayme. So the next time you watch American Gangster, enjoy the acting, enjoy the music. It is a great film. But when you see the credits roll, remember the 4 words that destroyed the script. Remember the white-haired woman in Harlem who stood up to the billion-dollar movie industry and said, no. Frank Lucas might have worn the chinchilla coat. He might have sat in the front row. But in the history books of Harlem, written in the ink of truth, he will always be the man who held the coat. The flunky, the driver, the myth. And Bumpy Johnson? Bumpy Johnson remains the king, untouched, unbroken, and thanks to Mayme, unforgotten.